In the heart of the Roman world, in the sun-drenched forums where law was proclaimed and poetry recited, there existed a parallel economy, a silent and brutal engine that powered the entire edifice of civilization. It was an economy not of coin or commodity, but of human flesh. Stand for a moment in the slave market of Delos, or near the Temple of Castor in Rome itself, and you witness the foundational truth of the empire, stripped bare of its marble pretenses. Here, men, women, and children stood on raised wooden platforms, their bodies oiled to catch the light, a small plaque hanging from their necks detailing their origin, their skills, and any known defects. Potential buyers, men of wealth and status, moved among them with the detached air of a farmer inspecting livestock. They would pry open mouths to check teeth, pinch limbs to test muscle, and command the captives to run or jump. They would inquire about temperament, obedience, and past rebellions. This was not an act of exceptional cruelty. It was a routine transaction, as mundane as buying a cask of wine or a bolt of silk. It was in this cold, calculated commodification of human life, this reduction of a person to an instrumentum vocale, a tool with a voice, that the true, dark genius of Roman power resided. To understand Rome is not merely to gaze upon the Colosseum or walk the Appian Way. It is to understand the millions of unseen lives that were broken to build them, and the systematic philosophy of subjugation that made it all not just possible, but necessary. We are often taught to see Rome through the eyes of its Caesars, its senators, and its poets. But to truly comprehend the nature of this civilization, we must invert our perspective. We must look up from the filth of the mine shaft, feel the sting of the overseer's whip in the fields, and hear the roar of the crowd from the blood-soaked sand of the arena. This is the story of Rome as seen through the eyes of its property, the story of the nameless millions whose forced labor, specialized skills, and violent deaths constituted the lifeblood of the Republic and the Empire. It is an exploration of a system so total and so pervasive that it was considered as natural as the rising of the sun, a system that defined every aspect of Roman life, from the intimacy of the bedroom to the grand strategy of imperial conquest. We will delve into the starkly different worlds inhabited by slaves, the precarious privilege of the urban domestic, the grinding anonymity of the agricultural labor, the hellish existence of the miner, and the spectacularized doom of the gladiator. And we will witness the ultimate expression of their despair, the volcanic eruption of rebellion that threatened to burn the Republic to the ground. This is the untold history of Rome's dark foundation, a testament to the enduring human cost of empire. In the early days of the Roman Republic, the institution of slavery was a far smaller and more intimate affair. It was primarily a domestic phenomenon, an unfortunate consequence of local warfare or debt bondage. A family might own one or two slaves, often captured from a neighboring Italian tribe, who would work alongside them in the fields or in the household. While their legal status was non-existent, a degree of shared culture and proximity could sometimes foster a relationship that, while unequal, was not yet defined by the industrial-scale brutality that would come later. These slaves were a part of the familia, the extended household, in a way that would become unthinkable in later centuries. The master, the paterfamilias, held the power of life and death over them, as he did over his own children, but the economic logic of the smallholding farm did not yet demand the ruthless efficiency and mass exploitation that would define the era of expansion. Society was not yet addicted to a constant influx of foreign bodies to fuel its growth. This earlier, more modest form of bondage was the seed from which a monstrous tree would grow, but it had not yet overshadowed the entire social and economic landscape. The turning point, the moment when Roman slavery metastasized from a domestic feature into a civilization-defining institution, can be traced to Rome's relentless military expansion, particularly during and after the Punic Wars against Carthage in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE. With each victorious campaign, a torrent of human life was funneled back towards Italy. The defeat of Carthage, the subjugation of Greece, the campaigns in Spain, and later, the conquest of Gaul under Julius Caesar, were not just military triumphs. They were the greatest slave raids in history. Hundreds of thousands of people at a time, soldiers, civilians, men, women, and children, were stripped of their identities, their families, and their freedom, becoming mere spoils of war. The numbers are staggering and difficult to comprehend. After the conquest of Epirus in 167 BCE, the Roman general Aemilius Paulus is said to have enslaved 150,000 people. Caesar's Gallic Wars reportedly resulted in the enslavement of 1 million Gauls. This massive, unprecedented influx fundamentally rewired the Roman economy and society. It created a vast, cheap, and disposable labor force that made possible the rise of the latifundia, the enormous agricultural estates that squeezed out the small family farm. It filled the burgeoning cities with servants, craftsmen, and functionaries, and it provided the human material for the state's most brutal spectacles. Roman society became dependent on this constant supply of conquered peoples, creating a self-perpetuating cycle. Conquest brought slaves, which generated wealth, which in turn funded new conquests. The intimate, if still oppressive, slavery of the early republic was dead, replaced by a vast, impersonal, and infinitely more cruel system of mass human exploitation. The initial consequences of this transformation were profound. The traditional Roman small farmer, the backbone of the early republic's army and its civic identity, could not compete with the latifundia. These vast plantations, owned by the senatorial elite and worked by gangs of chained slaves, could produce grain and wine on a scale that drove independent farmers into bankruptcy. Dispossessed and displaced, these former citizens flocked to Rome, forming a volatile and impoverished urban proletariat dependent on state handouts. The famous bread and circuses, this created a new social tension, a deep and bitter resentment between the fabulously wealthy elite and the landless poor. The character of Roman agriculture changed from subsistence farming to cash crop production for export, creating enormous fortunes for a select few. The master-slave relationship also grew more distant and brutal. On a small farm, the owner might know his slaves by name. On a latifundium with hundreds or thousands of workers, the owner was an absentee landlord living in luxury in Rome, while the slaves were managed by a cruel overseer whose only metric for success was maximizing profit. They were no longer individuals, but interchangeable parts in a vast agricultural machine, worked until they broke and then discarded. This new reality established a permanent state of undeclared war between master and slave, a simmering conflict that permeated every corner of the empire. Within this vast system, the experience of a slave was far from uniform. A deep chasm existed between the urban household slaves, the familia urbana, and their rural counterparts. For those selected for domestic service in the cities, life offered a precarious form of privilege. They lived within the walls of their master's domus, a world of relative comfort, better food, and protection from the elements. Yet this proximity to power was a double-edged sword. They were under the constant, watchful eye of the master and his family, their lives governed by caprice and whim. A dropped platter, a poorly prepared meal, or a perceived insolent glance could result in a brutal flogging or worse. They were privy to the most intimate secrets of the household, the political intrigues, the financial troubles, the marital infidelities, making them both indispensable and dangerous. A master's fear of being poisoned by a disgruntled cook or betrayed by a knowledgeable secretary was a pervasive anxiety among the Roman elite. The law reflected this terror. If a master was murdered in his home, it was common practice for every single one of his household slaves to be tortured and executed, regardless of their guilt or innocence. The roles within the familia urbana were incredibly diverse and often highly specialized. There were cooks, coccus, waiters, ministrator, bodyguards, and doormen, ostiarius, who were sometimes chained to the entrance like dogs. There were hairdressers, ornatrix, handmaidens, and wet nurses. More prestigious were the educated slaves, often Greeks, who served as tutors, pedagogus, for the master's children, as librarians, or as secretaries, amanuensis. A slave like Tiro, who belonged to the great orator and statesman Cicero, exemplifies the upper echelon of this world. Tiro was not merely a servant, but a trusted confidant, a literary assistant, and the inventor of a system of shorthand that bears his name. Cicero's letters reveal a relationship of genuine affection and intellectual partnership. He worried over Tiro's health, praised his work, and ultimately granted him his freedom. If the urban slave lived in a gilded cage, the rural slave, the member of the familia rustica, lived in an open-air prison. These were the men and women who toiled on the great latifundia of Sicily, southern Italy, and later, the provinces. Their existence was one of grinding, dehumanizing labor from sunrise to sunset. Roman agricultural writers like Cato the Elder and Varro discuss the management of these slaves with the cold, unsentimental logic of an accountant. Cato, in his treatise De Agricultura, offers chillingly practical advice. Slaves should be given a tunic, a cloak, and wooden shoes every other year. Their rations were carefully calculated for maximum work output at minimum cost, primarily cheap bread and sour wine. When they became old or sick, Cato's recommendation was stark: sell them. There was no room for sentiment. They were assets to be exploited until their productivity declined, at which point they were to be liquidated. Varro, writing a century later, famously categorized farm equipment into three types: mute tools, instrumentum mutum, like wagons; semi-articulate tools, instrumentum semivocale, like oxen; and articulate tools, instrumentum vocale, the slaves. This classification reveals the absolute objectification at the heart of the system. Life on the latifundia was deliberately organized to strip away identity and crush the will to resist. Slaves were often housed together in squalid barracks called ergastula, which were frequently subterranean prisons where they were locked away at night. During the day, they worked in chain gangs under the watchful eye of an overseer, Villicus, himself often a slave or freedman, whose own position depended on his ability to extract labor through fear and violence. The whip was the primary tool of motivation. Family units were systematically broken up at the slave market to prevent bonds of loyalty and solidarity from forming. A slave's name, their last link to their past life, was taken from them, replaced by a generic Latin name or one indicating their origin, like Cyrus for Syrian. Their lives were short, brutal, and anonymous. For them, there was no hope of manumission, no path to freedom. They were simply fuel for Rome's agricultural furnace, consumed and forgotten, their bones enriching the very soil they had been forced to work. This was the grim reality for the vast majority of slaves in the Roman world, a silent holocaust that unfolded day after day, century after century, across the sun-scorched fields of the empire. Yet, even below the hell of the latifundia, there was a deeper circle of suffering. This was the world of the mines. To be condemned to the mines, damnatio in metallo, was considered a fate worse than a swift execution. The mines, particularly the silver mines in Spain and the gold mines in Dacia, were engines of death that consumed human beings at an appalling rate. The historian Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BCE, left a harrowing account of the conditions in the Spanish silver mines, which paints a picture of a subterranean world of absolute despair. He describes thousands of men, many of them prisoners of war or criminals, working in perpetual darkness. They were forced to crawl through narrow, suffocating tunnels, lit only by the faint glimmer of oil lamps attached to their foreheads. They would spend months on end underground, never seeing the light of day. The labor was torturous and unceasing. Armed with primitive picks and hammers, they would chip away at the hard rock, the air thick with dust that filled their lungs and led to a slow, agonizing death. Children were used to crawl into the smallest crevices to gather the broken ore. Diodorus writes, "For no respite or pause is granted to them in their labors, but compelled by the blows of the overseers to endure the severity of their plight, they throw away their lives in this wretched manner. Indeed, death in their eyes is more to be desired than life. Because of the greatness of the hardships they are compelled to endure, The miners were often worked naked, in chains, under the constant threat of cave-ins, floods, and the overseer's lash. Their bodies were pushed to the absolute limit of human endurance, and then beyond. Life expectancy was measured in months, not years. This was not merely exploitation, it was extermination. The vast wealth that flowed from these mines, the silver that minted the denarii, the gold that adorned the temples, was extracted droplet by droplet through a process of calculated human sacrifice on an industrial scale. The miners were ghosts in the machine, their silent, suffering the price of imperial splendor. From the darkness of the mines, we move to the blinding light of the arena, and to the most famous and paradoxical of all Roman slaves, the gladiator. He was a man condemned to die for the entertainment of the masses, yet his body was a carefully honed instrument, fed and trained with more care than any agricultural slave. This world was centered on the ludus, the gladiatorial school, run by a lanista. The lanista was a businessman operating on the fringes of respectable society, despised as a pimp or a dealer in human flesh, yet indispensable for providing the entertainment the Roman public craved. Recruits swore an oath, the Sacramentum Gladiatorium, pledging to endure to be burned, to be bound, to be beaten, and to be killed by the sword. They lived in cells under constant guard. Their diet was carefully managed, often consisting of barley and beans to build a layer of fat that would protect underlying nerves and muscles from superficial cuts, prolonging the fight and making for a bloodier, more dramatic spectacle. They were trained in specialized combat styles, each with its own specific equipment and tactics. The retiarius, armed with a net and trident, would face the heavily armored secutor. The Thracian, with his curved scimitar and small shield, would battle the Murmillo, with his large shield and fish-crested helmet. This specialization turned combat into a form of deadly theater, a narrative of mismatched strengths and weaknesses that the crowd could understand and cheer for. They were not just fighters. They were characters in a public drama of life and death. On the day of the games, the gladiators would parade into the arena in ornate costumes, saluting the editor of the games with the legendary and likely apocryphal phrase, Ave, Imperator, Morituri, salutant, Hail, Emperor, those who are about to die salute you. The fight itself was a brutal affair, governed by rules and overseen by a referee. It was not always a fight to the death. A gladiator who fought bravely but was defeated could appeal to the crowd for mercy. The editor of the games would often read the will of the people, their thumbs turned up for mercy, missio, or down for death, jugula, slit the throat. For the victor, the rewards were fame, prize money, and perhaps, after many years of survival, the rudis, a wooden sword symbolizing their freedom. But for most, the arena was their final destination. Their bodies, if they died, were unceremoniously dragged from the sand by attendants dressed as Charon, the mythical ferryman of the underworld, and disposed of in a common pit. The gladiator represents the ultimate Roman paradox, the total commodification of a human being, elevated through training and spectacle into an object of public adoration, only to be destroyed for that same public's pleasure. His life was a testament to Rome's insatiable appetite for bread, blood, and circuses. The systematic brutality inherent in Roman slavery, from the latifundia to the mines, created a permanent state of latent insurgency. It was a pressure cooker with the lid screwed down tight. While small-scale acts of resistance, sabotage, theft, running away, or even a murder of an owner were constant, the conditions of slavery made large-scale, organized rebellion incredibly difficult. Slaves came from dozens of different ethnic and linguistic backgrounds, making communication and coordination a monumental challenge. They were watched, disarmed, and geographically dispersed. Yet, despite these obstacles, the pressure sometimes became too much to contain, and the system exploded in cataclysmic violence. The Roman Republic was shaken by 3 major slave wars, known as the Servile Wars, all of which erupted on the island of Sicily, a hotbed of the brutal latifundia system. The first 2, in the 2nd century BCE, were massive, bloody affairs that saw slave armies numbering in the tens of thousands seize control of large parts of the island before being mercilessly crushed by Roman legions. These were brutal warnings of the instability simmering just beneath the surface of Roman society. But it was the third and final civil war that would burn itself into the Roman consciousness forever. This was the rebellion of Spartacus. Unlike the previous revolts, this one began not in the fields of Sicily, but in the heart of Italy itself, in a ludus in the city of Capua. In 73 BCE, around 70 gladiators, led by a Thracian named Spartacus and two Gauls named Crixus and Enemaus, broke out of their barracks using kitchen implements as weapons. What began as a desperate bid for freedom by a small group of trained killers rapidly snowballed into the most serious crisis the Republic had faced in centuries. As they moved through the Italian countryside, their numbers swelled. They were joined by tens of thousands of runaway agricultural slaves, shepherds, and other dispossessed people, all drawn to Spartacus's banner by the promise of freedom and revenge. Spartacus proved to be a military genius, a charismatic leader who managed to forge this desperate, motley crew into a formidable fighting force. For 2 years, Spartacus and his army rampaged across Italy, defeating one Roman army after another. They crushed consular legions, plundered estates, and spread terror among the Roman elite. The initial Roman response was one of arrogant complacency. They sent praetors with hastily assembled militias, expecting to easily quash a minor slave uprising. Spartacus outmaneuvered and destroyed them. Rome was forced to acknowledge that this was not a mere rebellion, but a full-scale war. The fear in the city was palpable. Here was a slave army at the heart of the Republic, threatening the very foundations of their world order. The rebellion exposed the deep vulnerability of a society so utterly dependent on a vast, oppressed population. Spartacus's ultimate goal remains a subject of debate among historians. Did he intend to sack Rome? Or was he simply trying to lead his people across the Alps to freedom in their homelands? Whatever his plan, he demonstrated that the articulate tools of the Roman economy could, when organized and inspired, become a terrifyingly effective military power. The climax of the rebellion was as brutal as its beginning was audacious. The Roman Senate, finally grasping the existential nature of the threat, turned to the wealthiest man in Rome, Marcus Licinius Crassus. Given command of 8 legions, Crassus pursued Spartacus's army with grim determination. He was a ruthless commander who reinstated the practice of decimation, killing 1 in every 10 of his own soldiers, to restore discipline after a legion broke in the face of the slave army. After a series of hard-fought battles, Crassus managed to trap Spartacus and his forces in the toe of Italy. The final battle, in 71 BCE, was a desperate, bloody slaughter. Spartacus is said to have fought and died with incredible bravery, cutting his way towards Crassus's own position before being overwhelmed and killed. His body was never identified. The rebellion was broken, but Crassus was determined to make an example that would be seared into the memory of every slave in the empire for generations to come. The aftermath of the Spartacus rebellion was a calculated spectacle of terror. Crassus took 6,000 captured survivors from the final battle and subjected them to the ultimate punishment reserved for slaves and rebels: crucifixion. He had them crucified at regular intervals along the entire length of the Appian Way, the main road leading from Capua, where the rebellion began, all the way to Rome. For over 100 miles, the road was lined with the dying bodies of the rebels. It was a horrific public statement of Roman power and a warning of the futility of resistance. Anyone traveling to or from the capital city would be forced to witness this grotesque forest of crosses, to smell the stench of death, and to understand the price of challenging the established order. The message was clear and unambiguous. This is what happens to slaves who forget their place. The suppression of the revolt led to even harsher laws and greater paranoia. The grip of the masters tightened, and the chains, both literal and psychological, were drawn closer. The dream of freedom, so briefly ignited by Spartacus, was extinguished in an ocean of blood, leaving behind only a legend and a terrifying lesson. While rebellion was the most dramatic and ultimately most futile path out of slavery, there was another, more common route: manumission. This was the act of a master freeing a slave, turning them into a libertus or liberta, a freedman or freedwoman. The motivations for manumission were varied. It could be a reward for long and faithful service, as in the case of Cicero's Tyro. It was sometimes a purely economic decision. An owner could free a skilled slave and set them up in a business, taking a share of the profits without having to pay for their upkeep. Slaves were also sometimes allowed to save a small personal allowance, a peculium, with which they could eventually purchase their own freedom. A master might also free slaves in his will, an act of public generosity that enhanced his posthumous reputation. Yet, freedom, when it came, was not absolute. The bond between master and slave was not severed, but transformed. The freed slave became a client of their former master, who was now their patron. This relationship, known as patrocinium, was legally binding and deeply ingrained in the social fabric. The freedman owed his patron deference, respect, and a certain number of days of labor or other services opre. He was expected to support his patron in political matters, to leave him a portion of his property in his will, and to generally act as a loyal member of his extended network. In return, the patron offered protection, legal assistance, and a degree of social standing. While freedmen gained Roman citizenship, it was a limited, second-class version. They could not hold high public office, and their children often carried the stigma of their servile origins for a generation or two. Socially, they were often looked down upon by the freeborn, who viewed them with a mixture of envy for their potential wealth and contempt for their past. The figure of the vulgar, ostentatious, and newly rich freedman became a stock character in Roman literature, most famously embodied by Trimalchio in Petronius's Satyricon, a man whose lavish displays of wealth only served to highlight his low origins and lack of true aristocratic taste. Despite the social barriers, many freedmen achieved extraordinary success. They became wealthy merchants, skilled craftsmen, influential administrators, and powerful figures in the imperial bureaucracy. The imperial household itself was largely staffed by freedmen, who could rise to positions of immense power and influence, acting as the emperor's most trusted advisors and administrators. Men like Pallas and Narcissus, freedmen of the Emperor Claudius, effectively ran the empire for a time, amassing colossal fortunes and wielding more real power than most senators. This potential for upward mobility was a crucial element of the Roman system. It offered a sliver of hope, a powerful incentive for slaves, particularly in urban households, to be loyal, hard-working, and obedient. The possibility of freedom, however remote, served as a psychological safety valve, channeling the ambitions of the most capable slaves into cooperation with the system rather than rebellion against it. It demonstrated the pragmatism of Roman ideology. Even in freedom, the former slave remained bound to his master, his success ultimately reflecting back on the patron who had granted him his liberty. The journey from slave to freedman was a testament to both individual resilience and the remarkable capacity of the Roman power structure to absorb and co-opt potential threats, turning instruments of labor into pillars of the social order. The long-term consequences of Rome's reliance on slavery were profound and paradoxical. In the short term, it was an engine of immense wealth and power, enabling the construction of monumental architecture, the functioning of a complex urban society, and the generation of agricultural surpluses that fed the legions and the capital. However, this very dependence may have contained the seeds of Rome's later economic stagnation. The availability of a vast, cheap, and disposable labor force discouraged technological innovation. Why invest in labor-saving machinery when human beings could be worked to death for a fraction of the cost? While the Romans were brilliant engineers in civil and military projects, there was little advancement in agricultural or industrial technology for centuries. The economy became structurally reliant on continuous conquest to replenish the slave population. a model that was unsustainable once the empire reached its territorial limits in the 2nd century CE. When the flow of new slaves dwindled, the latifundia system faced a permanent labor crisis, contributing to the economic troubles of the later empire. Socially, the institution of slavery created a culture of casual brutality and a deep-seated contempt for manual labor among the elite. Work that could be done by a slave was seen as demeaning for a free citizen. This ideology permeated Roman society, creating a rigid social hierarchy where status was defined, in large part, by freedom from the necessity of physical toil. Furthermore, the constant fear of the enemy within, the millions of slaves who vastly outnumbered their masters, created a society rife with paranoia and reliant on spectacular displays of terror, like the crucifixion of Spartacus's followers, to maintain control. This foundation of violence and fear stands in stark contrast to the ideals of justice, law, and order, Pax Romana, that Rome projected as its great gift to the world. It is a fundamental contradiction that lies at the heart of the Roman achievement. Understanding this history is fraught with challenges. Our knowledge of Roman slavery comes almost exclusively from the writings of the master class. We have the agricultural manuals of Cato and Varro, the letters of Pliny and Cicero, the histories of Livy and Tacitus, and the satires of Petronius and Juvenal. We hear the slave's voice only through the filter of their owners. We have no slave narratives from ancient Rome, no first-hand accounts of life on the latifundia or in the mines written by those who endured it. Their experience must be reconstructed from archaeological evidence, shackles, inscriptions on slave collars, and by reading between the lines of elite sources, interpreting their anxieties, their casual cruelty, and their rare moments of empathy. Modern historians debate the precise numbers, the degree of brutality versus paternalism, and the overall economic impact of slavery. Some emphasize the potential for manumission and social mobility, while others focus on the overwhelming evidence of systemic violence and dehumanization. The truth, most likely, encompasses all of these contradictory elements. Roman slavery was not a monolith, but a complex spectrum of human experience, ranging from the trusted intellectual partner like Tyro to the anonymous, expendable wretch dying in a Spanish mine. What remains undeniable is the chasm between the public image Rome, crafted for itself, and the private reality on which it was built. The majestic ruins that draw millions of visitors today, the Colosseum, the Forum, the aqueducts, are monuments not only to Roman genius, but also to Roman brutality. They are soaked in the sweat and blood of forgotten millions. The philosophy of the Stoics, with its emphasis on enduring hardship and accepting one's fate, gains a poignant and darker resonance when one remembers that one of its greatest exponents, Epictetus, began his life as a slave. His teachings on inner freedom were forged in the crucible of outer bondage. The story of Roman slavery is a profound moral and historical lesson. It reveals how a society can achieve unparalleled heights of cultural, legal, and engineering sophistication while simultaneously institutionalizing a system of appalling cruelty. It is a cautionary tale about the corrupting nature of absolute power and the human capacity to rationalize exploitation by dehumanizing the exploited. In the end, we are left with a haunting legacy. The Roman world was not simply a world that had slaves, it was a slave society. The institution was not a peripheral feature, but the central pillar supporting its economy, its social structure, and even its sense of self. To look upon the bust of a Roman senator is to see a man whose leisure, education, and political power were made possible by the labor of hundreds of people he owned. To walk the streets of Pompeii is to tread upon ground maintained by slaves, in houses served by slaves, whose lives were extinguished alongside their masters by the volcanic ash. The silent, anonymous slave is the ghost at the Roman feast, the unseen foundation of the marble temple. Their story is a brutal reminder that civilization's greatest achievements often carry the heaviest human cost, and that behind the grand narratives of history lie countless untold stories of suffering, resilience, and the unquenchable, if often doomed, desire for freedom. Rome's greatness and its monstrosity were two sides of the same coin, minted from the silver of its mines and polished by the hands of its slaves.